The High King's Shadow. Deep in the iron heart of Ongband, where the air tasted of ash and the walls wept condensed shadow, Morgoth sat upon his throne and listened to reports that should have pleased him. Victory after victory, his captains told him. Whole companies of Noldor cut down in the passes of the Echoriath. Supply lines severed between Hithlum and Doriath. 3 minor strongholds taken in as many months. And yet, as each triumph was laid before him like tribute, the Dark Lord felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the mountain's depths. "Tell me of Fingolfin," he said, cutting through his lieutenant's recitation of captured territory. Sauron paused, his perfect features shifting almost imperceptibly. In the silence that followed, Morgoth could hear the distant hammering from the great forges below, where his armies of orcs and wolves and darker things took shape. The rhythm was steady, relentless, like a heartbeat that belonged to something vast and hungry. "The High King continues to coordinate the siege, my lord," Sauron said carefully. "His forces maintain their positions along the—" "I did not ask for a tactical summary." Morgoth's voice carried the weight of breaking mountains. "I asked about the Noldo himself." Sauron had served his master long enough to read the currents of his moods, the way pressure built before an eruption of wrath. This was different, though. Not rage. Something more unsettling. Something that made the Mire choose his words with unusual care. He was seen 3 days ago at the ford near Serech, rallying men who had broken before our host. They returned to the fight after he spoke to them. A pause. Our captain reported that the second-born mistook him for one of the Valar at first glance. Morgoth's fingers tightened on the armrest of his throne, metal creaking under the pressure. He remembered Fingolfin from the old days in Valinor, tall and stern and utterly, maddeningly incorruptible. While Fëanor had burned bright with passion and pride, easy to manipulate through his very intensity, Fingolfin had been stone. Steady, unmovable, the kind of opponent who could not be turned, only destroyed. And yet destruction had proven surprisingly elusive. 400 years, Morgoth said, almost to himself. 400 years of siege, and still he stands at my gates. The siege weakens them, my lord. Their supplies, the siege should have weakened him. Morgoth stood, his massive form unfolding like some primordial darkness given shape. It should have made him desperate, hungry, willing to make the mistakes that would let us crush him utterly. He began to pace, each footstep sending tremors through the stone. Instead he grows stronger, his alliances deepen, his legend spreads. Sauron said nothing. There was, truly, nothing to say. They both knew what reports had come from beyond the mountains, filtered through spies and captured tongues. The Eldar spoke of Fingolfin the way they had once spoken of the Valar themselves, as something unbreakable, eternal, worthy of the kind of love that bordered on worship. Worse, the second-born had begun to speak of him the same way. "Do you know what the men of Dor-lómin call him?" Morgoth asked, though he clearly did not expect an answer. "Elendil, friend of stars. They say that when he walks among them, the light of Valinor still clings to his hair. His laugh was like the sound of glaciers cracking. They think him touched by Eru himself. The truth of it sat between them like a weapon neither dared to pick up. Morgoth had faced armies before, had shattered kingdoms and reduced proud cities to rubble and ash. But armies could be beaten, kingdoms could fall, cities could be rebuilt. What Fingolfin represented was something altogether more dangerous. The idea that there were things in the world that could not be broken, should not be broken, would never yield no matter how much force was brought to bear against them. "My lord," Sauron ventured, Perhaps if we were to move against his sons directly. No. The word came out sharper than intended. No, that is the thinking of lesser minds. Strike at Fingon, and Fingolfin becomes a grieving father. Strike at Turgon, and Fingolfin becomes an avenger. Either way, we make him more dangerous, not less. Sauron was quiet for a long moment, processing this. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been genuine curiosity. Then what makes him so troublesome, my lord? He is skilled, yes, but others have been skilled. He is brave, but others have been brave. What sets him apart? Morgoth turned to face the great map carved into the wall of his throne room, where the lands of Beleriand spread before him like a game board. Tiny markers showed the positions of armies, the boundaries of kingdoms, the locations of strongholds and cities, and there, at the very edge of his domain, was the cluster of markers that represented the siege lines, hundreds of years of careful strategy reduced to scratches in stone. "He cannot be corrupted," Morgoth said finally. "I offered him everything once, in the early days, before the darkening. Power, knowledge, dominion over lands that would make Beleriand look like a garden plot." He listened politely, and then asked me why I thought such things would tempt him. The Dark Lord's expression shifted, becoming something almost thoughtful. "Do you know what is the most maddening about incorruptible virtue, my servant?" Sauron shook his head. "It makes you doubt yourself." Morgoth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Every time I look upon the map and see his forces holding their lines, maintaining their discipline, protecting the weak and giving hope to the hopeless, I am reminded of what I chose to abandon. What I decided was worthless." He was silent for a moment. "And some part of me, some small, persistent part, wonders if I was wrong." The admission hung in the air like a curse. Sauron felt something cold move through him, not unlike the sensation of watching a mountain begin to crumble. If his master could doubt, even for a moment, but doubt is a luxury we cannot afford, Morgoth continued, his voice hardening again. Fingolfin and his noble heart and his pristine conscience. He is the past, clinging to life beyond its time. We are the future. We are what the world is becoming, whether it wills it or not. He turned from the map to face Sauron directly. "Send word to the Forge Masters. Double production on the great weapons. Begin preparation for the final stroke." "My lord?" 400 years, Morgoth repeated. 400 years I have played at siege and strategy, trying to defeat him on his terms. Clean battle, honorable combat, the pretty warfare of the Eldar. His smile was like the edge of a blade. "No longer. If Fingolfin cannot be corrupted, cannot be broken, cannot be turned, then he will simply have to burn." As Sauron departed to carry out his orders, Morgoth remained alone, with his thoughts and his maps and the echo of hammering from the depths below. Somewhere beyond his walls, beneath stars he had tried to devour, Fingolfin walked among his people and spoke words that gave them strength. The thought should have filled the Dark Lord with rage. Instead, it filled him with something far more dangerous. The cold, creeping certainty that when the final battle came, one of them would not survive it. And for the first time in an age of the world, Morgoth was no longer entirely sure which one that would be. Echoes of Valinor. The throne room of Angband fell silent after Sauron's departure, leaving Morgoth alone with shadows that seemed to press closer in the flickering light of the forge fires below. He closed his eyes, and against his will, memory carried him back across the vast gulf of years, to halls filled with silver light instead of smoke, where the air had tasted of sea salt and starflower instead of ash and iron. Valinor. Even thinking the name brought a familiar ache, like the phantom pain of a severed limb. He had been Melkor then, mightiest of the Ainur, brother to Manwë and peer to Varda herself. The Valar had walked among the Eldar as friends and teachers, and he had walked among them as something else, entirely. A shadow in paradise, watching and learning and slowly, carefully, sowing seeds of doubt and desire. Most of the Eldar had been eager students. They had listened to his words about ambition and self-determination, about the narrow thinking of their Vala teachers, about the greater heights they might reach if they simply dared to grasp for more. Even the wisest among them, Elwë, Olwë, mighty Ingwo himself, had given him audience, had considered his suggestions with the gravity they deserved. But not the sons of Finwë. Not all of them. Feanor now. Feanor had been different, but different in a way that served Morgoth's purposes. The eldest son burned with a light that was beautiful and terrible and utterly consuming. His passion for creation, for perfection, for leaving a mark upon the world that would outlast the breaking of Arda itself. That passion could be fed, shaped, directed toward ends that its bearer never quite intended. Morgoth had whispered to Feanor about the jealousy of the Valar, about powers they hoarded selfishly, about the glory that awaited those bold enough to seize their own destiny. And oh, how readily Feanor had listened, how eagerly he had drunk in every word about independence and pride and the right of the created to surpass their creators. The Silmarils themselves had been born, at least in part, from seeds that Morgoth had planted. The idea that Feanor could capture something that even the Valar could not replicate, could create beauty that would outlast the world itself. The irony was bitter as wormwood. Morgoth's greatest triumph in corrupting Feanor had ultimately led to his own downfall. The oath that bound Feanor's sons, the kinslaying at Alqualonde, the burning of the ships, all of it had flowed from ambitions that Morgoth himself had nurtured. And yet those same ambitions had driven Feanor to Middle-earth, had brought the Noldor across the sea with war in their hearts, and Morgoth's name on their lips as a curse. But Fingolfin had been another matter entirely. Morgoth's eyes opened, and he found himself staring at the carved map on his wall without truly seeing it. In his mind's eye, he saw instead a different throne room, one where crystal columns caught and reflected the light of the trees, where the floors were white stone veined with silver, where the air itself seemed to sing with half-heard music. He had approached Fingolfin there in the early days after the Eldar had come to Valinor. Not openly, never openly. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, he had come as a counselor might come, full of wisdom and gentle suggestions. He had spoken of the burden of leadership, of the weight of responsibility, of the choices that strong leaders sometimes had to make for the greater good of their people. "You understand sacrifice," he had said to Fingolfin, his words carefully chosen, his tone perfectly pitched between respect and sympathy. "I have watched you, son of Finwë, and I see in you the kind of strength that your people will need in the dark days ahead. But strength alone is not enough. A true leader must be willing to accept difficult truths, to make choices that lesser minds would shy away from." Fingolfin had listened with the courtesy that was his nature, his grey eyes steady and unreadable. When Morgoth finished speaking, the Noldo had been quiet for a long moment, as if genuinely considering the words. Then he had said, "And what difficult truths would you have me accept, Lord Melkor?" The question had been asked without rancour, without suspicion, with nothing but honest curiosity. And yet somehow, in that moment, Morgoth had felt exposed in a way that was profoundly uncomfortable, as if Fingolfin could see through not just his words but his intentions, his very essence, and was asking him to acknowledge what they both knew he was really offering. "Only this," Morgoth had replied carefully, "that the world is wider and more complex than the Valar would have your people believe. That there are powers and possibilities they have not shared with you, paths to greatness that they have deemed inappropriate for your kind." Inappropriate. Fingolfin had repeated the word as if tasting it, his expression thoughtful. And these powers, these paths, they would serve my people well. They would serve any people well, who were strong enough to walk them. Fingolfin had nodded slowly, and for one shining moment Morgoth had thought he might have found another crack in the armor of elvish loyalty, another wedge he could drive between the Eldar and their Valar guardians. Then Fingolfin had smiled, not the brittle smile of someone caught between difficult choices, but something warm and genuine and utterly devastating in its simplicity. "I thank you for your concern, Lord Melkor," he had said, "but I think my people are well served by the path we already walk. If the Valar have deemed some powers inappropriate for us, then I suspect they have good reason for their judgment. I am content to trust in their wisdom." Content. Not resigned, not bitter, not secretly yearning for something more. Content. As if the very idea of reaching beyond what had been freely given was not just unnecessary, but somehow distasteful. Morgoth had pressed further, of course. Over the years that followed, he had returned again and again to the subject, each time with new arguments, new appeals to pride or ambition or simple curiosity. He had spoken of the music of creation, of the rights of the Ainuor's children, of the narrow thinking that would keep the Eldar forever as students, rather than allowing them to become teachers in their own right. Fingolfin had listened to it all with the same patient attention, the same genuine consideration. And each time, his answer had been the same: trust. Not in Morgoth's grand visions of transcendence, but in the simpler certainties of loyalty and love and the bonds that connected him to his people and his guardians alike. It had been maddening. It had been incomprehensible. And worst of all, it had forced Morgoth to confront the possibility that his vision of inevitable corruption, the idea that every thinking being would eventually hunger for more than they had been given, might not be as universal as he had believed. The memory shifted, bringing with it the taste of salt spray and the sound of waves against stone. Ulmo's halls, where the Lord of Waters held court beneath the sea, and where the friendship between the Vala and Finwë's second son had deepened with each passing year. Morgoth had watched that friendship with growing unease, recognizing in it something that went beyond mere political alliance or even personal affection. Ulmo and Fingolfin had understood each other in a way that transcended words. The Vala of the seas and the elven prince had shared something that Morgoth, for all his power and knowledge and age beyond reckoning, had never quite been able to grasp: a fundamental contentment with their place in the music of creation, a joy that came not from grasping for more, but from participating fully in what already was. It had been that friendship, more than anything else, that had convinced Morgoth that Fingolfin couldn't be turned. Not because the elf lacked ambition or courage or vision, but because he possessed something that made such corruptions irrelevant. A deep, unshakable sense that he was exactly where and what he was meant to be. The throne room of Angband reasserted itself around him, dragging him back to the present with its weight of stone and shadow and the eternal smell of smoke. But the echo of that old frustration remained, sharp as a blade between his ribs. Fëanor had been fire, brilliant, dangerous, ultimately destructive to everything he touched, including himself. His sons had inherited that flame, and it had driven them to oath and exile and endless war. They were magnificent enemies, terrible and beautiful, and ultimately predictable in their fury. Fingolfin was water, steady, persistent, impossible to corrupt because corruption required cracks and flaws and secret hungers, and he possessed none of these things. He simply was what he was, completely and without reservation, and no amount of pressure or persuasion or time could change the essential nature of what that meant. And that, Morgoth realized with a clarity that was as cold as winter starlight, was why Fingolfin frightened him. Not because the elf was strong or skilled or dangerous in battle, though he was all of these things, but because he represented the possibility that Morgoth's entire understanding of existence might be wrong, that there might, in fact, be beings in the world who could not be broken, should not be broken, and who found in their unbrokenness not limitation, but perfect freedom. The thought was intolerable. It was also, Morgoth suspected, entirely true. In the distance, the hammers of his forges continued their endless work, shaping metal and malice into forms that would soon march forth to test that hypothesis once and for all. And in his throne room, Morgoth sat in darkness and remembered light, and tried not to think about which one had felt more like home. The siege tightens. The assault came at dawn, as Fingolfin's attacks always did, not because the High King favored the symbolism of light over darkness, but because 4 centuries of warfare had taught him that Morgoth's creatures fought with desperate fury in the dark and sluggish confusion in the day. The sun was a weapon, and like all weapons in Fingolfin's arsenal, it was used with precision. From his position on the ridge overlooking the Anfauglith, Fingolfin watched as 3 companies of his finest cavalry swept down from the northern passes. To any observer, it would look like a standard harassment raid, quick, sharp, designed to draw defenders away from Angband's outer works before melting back into the wilderness. Morgoth's captains had seen such attacks 100 times in the past year alone. They had not yet learned to look for the signal fires that burned, brief as summer lightning, on the peaks behind the riders. The first company struck the eastern watchposts exactly as expected, their bright mail and drawn swords catching the morning light like a challenge. Horns blew from Angband's walls, and the great gates began to grind open, disgorging companies of orcs and wolves to drive the elven raiders back. It was a dance that both sides knew well. Thrust and parry, advance and retreat, the endless rhythm of a siege that had ground on for longer than some kingdoms had existed. But as the defenders poured out to meet this familiar threat, Fingolfin's true stroke fell elsewhere. The second signal fire blazed atop Thangorodrim's eastern peak, and suddenly the Anfauglith erupted with movement as hidden companies emerged from concealment. Not from the north, where the first attack had drawn every eye, but from the south and west, from positions that should have been impossible to reach without crossing leagues of open ground under the watchful gaze of Angband's sentries. Except that Fingolfin had not tried to cross that open ground. For 3 months, his engineers had been digging. Not the obvious earthworks and siege trenches that scarred the landscape around every major assault, but something far more ambitious. Tunnels, miles of them, spreading out from hidden entrances in the hills like the roots of some vast tree, converging on points that Morgoth's mapmakers had marked as secure. The orc companies that rushed out to meet the northern raiders found themselves attacked from behind by elven warriors who seemed to rise from the earth itself. Before they could reorganize, before they could send word back to the fortress, they were cut off, surrounded by enemies who knew exactly where they were going, and exactly how long they had to complete their work. Fingolfin allowed himself a thin smile as he watched his carefully orchestrated trap unfold. This was not the wild, passionate warfare that his eldest brother Feanor had favoured, all fire and fury and glorious charges into certain death. This was something else entirely. War as art, as mathematics, as the patient application of intelligence and will against an enemy who had grown careless with centuries of seeming advantage. The third signal fire blazed, and the final phase began. Hidden companies of men emerged from the western hills, not the great lords of Dor-lomin or the proud horsemen of Hithlum, but hunters and woodsmen who had learned to move like shadows across the broken lands. Their task was not to fight the creatures of Angband in open battle, but to do what they did best: find the supply lines that fed Morgoth's armies, the hidden paths that carried messages between the fortress and its far-flung outposts, the weak points that no amount of orc sentries could adequately guard. By the time the sun reached its zenith, half a dozen of Angband's advance positions had simply vanished. Not destroyed in the dramatic fashion that songs were made of, but cut off, isolated, rendered useless. The great fortress itself remained inviolate behind its walls of iron and malice, but its reach had been shortened by leagues, and in his command tent on the ridge, Fingolfin studied reports and adjusted his plans, and prepared for the next phase of a campaign that was measured not in days or months, but in decades. "The eastern approach is clear, my lord," reported Galdor of Dor-lomin, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just watched a perfect plan executed flawlessly. "Their watchposts are down, their patrol routes disrupted. We could push heavy cavalry through the gap by tomorrow night." Fingolfin shook his head. "Too soon. Let them wonder first. Let them send out scouts to discover what happened. Let them stretch their forces thin, trying to cover ground they thought was secure." He turned to face the assembled captains, elves and men who had learned to trust his judgment through 4 centuries of careful victories. "Fear makes enemies predictable. We will give Morgoth time to be afraid." There was a murmur of agreement from the gathered commanders, but Fingolfin could see the hunger in their eyes. They had tasted victory today, had seen their strategies bear fruit in ways that made the long siege seem suddenly, impossibly winnable. It was a dangerous mood, the kind that led to overreach, to the sort of glorious folly that had doomed so many armies before them. "Remember," Fingolfin said quietly, "we are not trying to storm Angband. Not yet. We are trying to make it a prison instead of a fortress. Every supply line we cut, every outpost we take, every route we close, it makes the walls a little higher, the darkness a little deeper, the weight of containment a little harder to bear." In the depths of Angband, Morgoth felt that weight like a physical thing pressing against his chest. The throne room that had once felt vast and imposing now seemed cramped, its walls pressing inward with each report of another failure. 3 watchposts taken, 6 patrol routes compromised, supply convoys that had not reported in for days, probably feeding crows somewhere in the wilderness beyond his sight. "How?" he demanded of the assembled captains who cowered before his throne. "How does an army of tree dancers and flower weavers outfight creatures bred for war?" None of them dared answer. The Balrog that served as his chief lieutenant shifted uncomfortably, its form radiating heat that made the air shimmer. Even among the Maiar fallen into darkness, there was no good explanation for what they were witnessing. Sauron stepped forward, his perfect features carefully composed. "My lord, they fight with advantages we haven't adequately accounted for. Time, most crucially. They can afford to wait, to plan, to execute strategies that span years or decades. We cannot." "Cannot?" The word came out as a growl that shook dust from the ceiling. Our forces require constant feeding, constant motivation through fear and promise of conquest. The Eldar fight for their homes, their children, their future, motivations that sustain themselves. Our orcs fight because they must. The difference becomes more apparent with each passing season. Morgoth was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Around him, the assembled commanders waited with the stillness of prey animals, hoping to avoid a predator's notice. "You are telling me," Morgoth said finally, "that after 400 years of siege, they are winning. Not winning, my lord, but not losing either. And for them, those may amount to the same thing." The thought that followed was too terrible to speak aloud, but Morgoth could see it reflected in his lieutenant's eyes. If the siege could not be broken through conventional means, if Fingolfin's patient strategy continued to tighten its grip season after season, year after year, then eventually, impossibly, Angband might actually fall. Not through storm and assault, not through the dramatic clash of armies that songs were made of, but through the slow, inexorable pressure of an enemy who understood that time was on their side. Morgoth rose from his throne, his massive form casting shadows that seemed to move independently of his movements. "Double the guard on all approaches. Triple it. I want every path, every hill, every stone that could hide an elven spy under constant watch." "My lord," one of the orc captains ventured, "we lack the numbers to—" The captain's words ended in a scream that echoed through the halls of Angband, like a promise. When the echoes died, Morgoth's voice filled the silence with the weight of falling mountains. "Find the numbers. Take them from the forges, from the breeding pits, from the deep places where we house our sleeping horrors. Strip every garrison from here to the Sea of Helkar if you must, but I will not have my own fortress turned into a trap." As his servants scattered to carry out impossible orders, Morgoth stood alone in his throne room and tried not to think about the growing certainty that Fingolfin was not simply planning to contain Angband, he was planning to take it. Outside, beyond the reach of Morgoth's sight, the siege of Angband continued its patient work. In hidden tunnels, elven engineers mapped the fortress's weaknesses with methodical precision. In the camps of men, smiths worked to forge weapons that could pierce orc mail and dragon scale alike. In the command tents of the Alliance, maps were updated and strategies refined, and the long, careful campaign entered its next phase. And on a ridge overlooking the Anfauglith, Fingolfin stood beneath the stars his people had first learned to love in the days before the world's pain began, and planned the moves that would bring him, step by careful step, to the gates of his greatest enemy. The siege was tightening. After 4 centuries, the trap was almost ready to close. The unheeding crown, the petitioner who knelt before Fingolfin's throne, was not the sort of supplicant that kings of old Valinor might have expected. He was a man, for one thing, dark-haired and weathered, with the calloused hands of someone who had spent more years holding a plough than a sword. His clothes bore the simple weave of Dor Lomin, and when he raised his eyes to meet the High King's gaze, there was none of the elaborate deference that court protocol might have demanded, only the straightforward respect of one honest soul acknowledging another. "Speak, friend," Fingolfin said, his voice carrying easily through the great hall despite its gentleness. Around the throne, elven lords and mortal captains stood in quiet attention, but the High King's focus was entirely on the man before him. "What brings you so far from your fields?" "My son, Lord." The man's voice carried the weight of a father's grief, carefully controlled but unmistakable. He served in the 4th Company of Lord Hurin's cavalry, fell 3 months past in the raid on the eastern approaches. His captain tells me he died well, fought bravely, helped save the lives of his fellows. A pause. But the captain also tells me that my boy's sword was taken by orcs before the company could retrieve the dead. Fingolfin leaned forward slightly, and those who knew him well recognized the particular stillness that came over the High King when someone's pain demanded his full attention. This sword, it was precious to you. My grandfather's blade, Lord, carried it through the crossing of the ice, back in the early days. Only thing of worth my family ever owned. The man's hands clenched briefly at his sides. I know it's just metal, Lord. I know there's greater matters for kings to worry about. But the boy, he was so proud to carry it. Said it made him feel like he belonged, fighting alongside the Eldar and the great houses. The hall was perfectly quiet. In another court, under another king, such a petition might have been dismissed with empty comfort or relegated to some minor functionary. The loss of one mortal soldier's heirloom was hardly a matter for the attention of a high king who commanded the loyalty of dozens of peoples across half of Beleriand. But this was not another court, and Fingolfin was not another king. Fingon, the High King said, turning to his eldest son, who stood among the assembled lords with his own expression of careful attention. How fares the pursuit of those orc companies? We broke their main force 2 days past, Father. Scattered the survivors into the hills. My scouts report they're making for the old stronghold at Eridwethrin, but moving slowly, many wounded, supplies exhausted. Fingon paused, understanding passing between father and son like a shared language. A small company of volunteers could overtake them easily. Then let it be so. Fingolfin's attention returned to the petitioner. My son will personally lead a company to recover what was taken from the fallen, including your son's blade. It will be returned to you with the honor it deserves. The man's composure finally cracked, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. Lord, there's no need for such. It's just one sword. No. Fingolfin rose from his throne, and the simple movement somehow filled the great hall with presence and authority. It is not just one sword. It is the blade your grandfather carried across the Helcaraxe in the service of loyalty and love. It is the weapon your son bore in defense of his people and his hope for the future. It is a symbol of the bond between your house and mine, between men and Eldar, between all who stand together against the darkness. He stepped down from the dais to stand before the man as an equal. Such things are never just anything. They are the foundation upon which trust is built and kingdoms endure. When the petitioner had departed, walking taller than when he had entered, Turgon approached his father with the expression he wore when wrestling with difficult thoughts. You do realize, the King of Gondolin said quietly, that every favor of this sort sets a precedent. That word of such generosity will spread, and soon every family who has lost something precious will feel entitled to the personal attention of the High King. Fingolfin smiled, the expression transforming his stern features with genuine warmth. I certainly hope so. Father, tell me, my son, what do you think Morgoth would have done with such a petition? Turgon was quiet for a moment, considering. Ignored it, most likely. Or perhaps had the petitioner punished for daring to waste his time with such trivial concerns. And what lesson would that teach the peoples under his rule? That their pain doesn't matter. That their loyalty is expected but not valued. That they are... Turgon paused, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. That they are expendable. Precisely. Fingolfin began to walk toward the great windows that looked out over the camp and the lands beyond. his sons falling into step beside him. Morgoth rules through fear, because fear is all he has left to offer. He has forgotten, perhaps never understood, that true strength comes not from the ability to compel obedience, but from inspiring the kind of loyalty that makes obedience irrelevant. They paused at the windows, looking out over a scene that spoke to the truth of those words. In the courtyard below, Eldar and Edain moved together with the easy familiarity of long association. An elf lord discussed supply routes with a captain of Dorlomin, their conversation animated, but respectful. Children, both mortal and immortal, played together in the shadows of the walls, their laughter rising like music on the afternoon air. Smiths of both kindreds worked side by side at the forges, sharing techniques that each people had developed in isolation and that together created weapons finer than either could have made alone. "Look upon this," Fingolfin said softly, "and ask yourself, what force could break such bonds? What threat could divide peoples who have learned to see their differences as strength rather than division?" Fingon, who had been quietly watching the scene below, spoke for the first time. "Morgoth fears this more than our armies." "Yes." Fingolfin's voice carried the weight of certainty earned through centuries of observation and struggle. "He fears it because he cannot understand it. In his mind, every relationship is a calculation of power and advantage. Every alliance is temporary, based on mutual benefit, and ready to dissolve the moment that benefit ends. He cannot conceive of loyalty that asks for nothing in return, or trust that deepens rather than weakens under pressure." "And so he misreads our strength," Turgon added, his strategic mind following the implications. "He prepares for the betrayals and fractures that would have come in his alliances, never realizing that our bonds grow stronger with each test." "More than that," Fingolfin said, turning from the window to face his sons directly. "He misreads himself. Every time he witnesses the loyalty we inspire, every time he sees men and elves united in common cause, every time he observes justice being done simply because it is right to do so, it reminds him of what he chose to abandon, what he decided was worthless." The High King's expression grew thoughtful. "And somewhere in the depths of his fortress, in the small hours when even the mighty must face themselves without the armor of justification, I think he wonders if he was wrong." The thought hung in the air between them, as dangerous in its implications as any weapon. "If that's true," Fingon said carefully, "then he will eventually be forced to test that doubt, to prove to himself once and for all that his vision of the world is the correct one." "Yes," Fingolfin agreed, "he will. And when that day comes, we must be ready to show him that some things in this world cannot be broken, should not be broken, and will endure long after his dominion has passed into memory and song." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, messengers arrived from across Beleriand. They brought word that had become almost routine after 4 centuries of siege. Another supply convoy intercepted, another patrol route compromised, another small victory in the long campaign of containment that kept Morgoth's influence from spreading beyond the reach of his mountain fortress. But they brought other news as well. Word that the smiths of Nogrod had sent another shipment of weapons, crafted with techniques shared by elven masters. Reports that the lords of Estelad had committed 2 new companies to the siege lines, motivated not by obligation, but by genuine desire to stand with the Eldar against the darkness. Stories of young men traveling hundreds of miles, simply for the chance to serve under the banner of the High King, drawn by tales of a ruler who valued justice over conquest, and who treated all his subjects, immortal and mortal alike, as family worthy of protection. In distant Angband, similar reports would be reaching Morgoth's throne. But where Fingolfin saw confirmation of hope and unity, the Dark Lord would see only further evidence of a conspiracy he could not understand, and a strength he could not replicate. The contrast was not lost on Fingolfin as he stood on the walls of his camp that night, looking out toward the distant glow of forge fires that marked his enemy's stronghold. Two kings, two visions of what power meant and how it should be wielded. One built on fear and the certainty that all beings would eventually reveal their essential selfishness. The other founded on trust and the conviction that even the humblest soul contained depths of loyalty and courage that could shame the mighty. Soon, Fingolfin suspected, they would discover which vision could endure when tested by the fires of ultimate conflict. The High King touched the sword at his side. Ringil, forged in Valinor in the days before the world's shadow fell, a weapon that had never tasted defeat because it had only ever been drawn in defense of things worth defending. When that test came, when doubt finally drove Morgoth to desperate action, Fingolfin would meet it as he had met every challenge in his long reign, with justice in his heart, trust in his allies, and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any price to preserve. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient as the kings who ruled in their light. In the distance, the siege lines maintained their vigilant watch, and the slow work of containment continued into another night. But in the depths of Angband, something was stirring, plans within plans, desperation breeding the kind of terrible resolve that would soon transform the patient chess game of siege into something far more destructive and final. The crown that Fingolfin wore needed no gold or jewels to mark its authority. It was made of trust freely given, loyalty earned through justice, and the kind of strength that came not from the ability to compel, but from the wisdom to inspire. Such crowns, once forged, could not be broken by any force in all the kingdoms of the world. It was that unbreakable truth that Morgoth feared most of all. Councils of despair. The council chamber lay deeper within Angband than even most of its inhabitants knew existed. 7 levels below the throne room, past gates that had not been opened in decades, through passages that twisted and descended until they seemed to burrow toward the very heart of the world. Here, in a vast hollow carved from living rock, Morgoth held court with those few servants who commanded not just his trust, but his attention. The air was thick with more than darkness. It carried the weight of plans that had festered in shadow, of contingencies that had waited centuries for their moment of necessity. Around the black stone table that dominated the chamber, figures that in the outer world would have commanded armies and toppled kingdoms sat as mere advisors to a will that had shaped the music of creation itself. Sauron occupied the seat to Morgoth's right, his perfect features composed in the expression of careful attention he had perfected over long ages of service. To the left sat Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, his massive form radiating heat that made the air shimmer even in the chamber's oppressive gloom. Around the table's circumference, others of the Maiar who had followed their master into exile maintained their own varieties of watchful silence. 400 years, Morgoth said, his voice carrying no more emotion than stone grinding against stone. 400 years of siege, and still we sit in council, speaking of containment, of defense, of holding what we have rather than taking what should be ours. His gaze swept the assembled figures, and several of them shifted uncomfortably under its weight. I am weary of such talk. The words fell into silence that stretched until even the distant sound of the forges seemed to fade into nothingness. Then Sauron leaned forward slightly, the movement calculated to draw attention without seeming to presume. "My lord," he said carefully, "the situation above continues to deteriorate. Our latest estimates suggest that Fingolfin commands not merely the loyalty of the Noldor, but active support from no fewer than 8 different houses of men, 3 clans of dwarves, and—" He paused, as if the next words required particular precision. "And there are rumors that even some among the green elves have begun to speak favorably of alliance with the High King." "Rumors," Gothmog rumbled, his voice like the sound of mountains breaking. "Always rumors with you, Sauron. As if whispers and hearsay could match the strength of fire and iron." "Whispers," Sauron replied with the patience of someone who had endured such exchanges many times before, "become armies. Hearsay becomes alliance. The strength of fire and iron means nothing if it is trapped behind walls that grow stronger with each passing season." Enough. Morgoth's single word cut through the brewing argument like a blade through silk. "Tell me of your counsel, Sauron. What would you have us do?" "Strike at the heart," Sauron said without hesitation. "Not at his armies, not at his strongholds, but at Fingolfin himself. One blade in the right place, at the right moment, could accomplish what 1,000 years of siege have failed to achieve." His eyes gleamed with something that might have been anticipation. "Remove the focal point of their unity, and watch how quickly their grand alliance crumbles into its component parts. You speak of assassination." The words came from Thuringwethil, whose voice carried the memory of better days, and whose loyalty had been bought with promises that grew more distant with each passing age. "Of murder by stealth and poison. Is this what the mighty Morgoth has been reduced to?" Sauron's perfect features shifted almost imperceptibly. "I speak of victory by whatever means necessary. Fingolfin commands their loyalty because they see him as incorruptible, untouchable, somehow beyond the reach of ordinary mortality. Prove that assumption wrong, and you shatter not just their king, but their faith itself." "And yet," said another voice from the shadows at the table's far end, "such an approach assumes we can reach him. Fingolfin is not some mortal lord who walks unguarded through his halls. He is surrounded constantly by those who would die to preserve him, protected by wardings that our greatest sorcerers have tried and failed to penetrate. The very attempt might well cost us more than success would gain." Morgoth listened to the debate with the stillness of a predator calculating distances. Around the table, his servants argued strategies and tactics with the desperate energy of those who sensed that failure was no longer an option their master would tolerate. But beneath their words, beneath their carefully reasoned proposals and counter-arguments, he could hear the deeper truth that none of them dared speak aloud. They were losing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the inexorable certainty of water wearing away stone. Every month that passed saw their position weaken, their options narrow, their ability to project force beyond Angband's walls diminish. The siege that should have been a temporary inconvenience had become a strangling cord that tightened with each passing season, and at the center of it all stood Fingolfin, untouchable not because of walls or guards or sorceress protection, but because of something far more dangerous, the willing devotion of those who followed him. "What of a direct assault?" Gothmog's voice cut through the increasingly heated debate like a sword through spider's silk. "Not assassination, not subtlety, not the games that you Maiar favor. What of honest war, strength against strength?" The Balrog Lord's suggestion brought immediate protests from around the table. Too costly, they said. Too likely to fail. Too much risk for uncertain gain. But Morgoth found himself listening with something approaching interest. "Speak," he commanded, and the protests died as if cut off by a blade. Gothmog's massive form seemed to expand as he leaned forward, his eyes glowing like coals in a furnace. 4 centuries we have sat behind these walls like besieged merchants, counting our supplies and rationing our strength. 4 centuries of reacting to their moves instead of making moves of our own. We have dragons sleeping in the deepest pits, armies beyond counting, waiting in the breeding chambers, powers that have slumbered since the foundation of the world. His voice rose until it filled the chamber like the roar of a forge fire. Why do we hoard such strength? What are we saving it for, if not for this? Because, Sauron interjected with cutting precision, once those forces are committed, once those powers are unleashed, there is no calling them back. Fail with conventional armies, and you can rebuild. Fail with the great weapons, and you have nothing left with which to try again. Then we do not fail, Gothmog replied simply. We unleash everything. Fire and dragon, orc and wolf, power that has waited ages for its moment of release. We burn their siege lines to ash, their armies to bone, their alliance to scattered refugees fleeing in terror toward whatever holes might hide them. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Where before it had carried the weight of desperation held in check, now it thrummed with possibility. Dark possibility, terrible possibility, but possibility nonetheless. Morgoth's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft as falling ash and twice as deadly. Continue. The Anfoglith becomes a sea of fire, Gothmog said, his words painting visions that made the air itself seem to burn. Rivers of flame pour from every gate of Angband, consuming everything in their path. The great worm Glaurung leads our hosts, and behind him march armies that have not seen sunlight since the first rising of the moon. We do not seek to break their lines. We seek to obliterate the very concept of resistance. Their tunnels, someone protested from across the table. Their hidden positions, their supply routes. Fire cannot reach what is buried deep enough. Fire can reach anything, Gothmog snarled, if you have enough of it. Morgoth stood, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to move independently of his movements. Around the table, his servants felt the weight of his attention, like a physical force pressing against their consciousness. You speak of the Dagor Bragolok, he said, giving name to what had, until now, existed only as desperate hope and whispered contingency. The Battle of Sudden Flame. The moment when we abandon all restraint and commit everything to a single, overwhelming stroke. He began to pace around the table, each footstep sending tremors through the stone. And if it fails, if Fingolfin's alliance proves stronger than our fire, more enduring than our fury, then we learn whether the songs of the Eldar are true, Gothmog replied without flinching. Whether there truly are things in this world that cannot be broken by any force, no matter how great. But my lord, his voice dropped to something almost resembling reverence. Would that not be worth knowing? Would the certainty not be preferable to this endless doubt? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a dare, like the edge of a cliff that demanded a choice between retreat and the leap into unknown depths. Around the table, Morgoth's servants waited for their master's judgment, each knowing that whatever decision emerged from this chamber would reshape the fate of Beleriand itself. How long? Morgoth asked finally. How long to wake the dragons, to marshal the armies, to prepare the weapons of fire that have slept too long in darkness? 6 months, Sauron said, his mind already calculating logistics and supply chains, and the 1,000 details that would transform vision into reality. perhaps less, if we strip resources from every other endeavor. Then let it be so. Morgoth's voice carried the finality of falling mountains. Send word to the deepest pits. Wake what has slumbered. Forge what has been delayed. In 6 months' time, we will discover whether Fingolfin's virtue can withstand the fires of absolute war. As his servants dispersed to carry out impossible orders, Morgoth remained alone in the council chamber, surrounded by shadows that seemed to press closer with each passing moment. In the silence that followed, he could hear the distant hammering of his forges taking on a new urgency, the sound of a realm preparing for the kind of war that ended not in victory or defeat, but in transformation. Soon, very soon, he would have his answer. Either Fingolfin would prove as breakable as every other being that had ever stood against him, or Morgoth would learn that there were indeed things in the world that could not be conquered by force alone. The thought should have brought him satisfaction. Instead, it brought only the cold certainty that one way or another, the next 6 months would determine not just the fate of the siege, but the truth about himself that he had spent ages trying to avoid. In the depths of Angband, the councils of despair had reached their conclusion. Now came the time for action, and the test that would determine whether fear or hope would shape the future of the world. Rivers of fire. The first sign was not sound, but silence. Fingolfin stood on the observation platform that overlooked the northern approaches to Angband, reviewing the morning reports with the methodical attention that had sustained the siege through 4 centuries of careful warfare. The dawn mist was beginning to lift from the Anfauglith, revealing the familiar landscape of siege lines and earthworks that stretched to the horizon like the careful geometry of some vast garden. Everything was as it should be. Patrols moving in their accustomed patterns, sentries at their posts, the great engines of war standing ready in their prepared positions. Then the hammering stopped. For 400 years, the sound of Morgoth's forges had been the constant heartbeat of the siege, a rhythm so pervasive that it had become part of the very air they breathed. Day and night, season after season, year after year, the hammers had beaten their iron song, forging the weapons and armor that kept Angband's armies supplied. The sound had become so familiar that its presence was noted only by its absence. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that absence became a roar. The ground beneath Fingolfin's feet began to tremble, not with the familiar vibrations of distant industry, but with something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself convulsing in pain. The mist that had been lifting from the plain suddenly thickened, taking on colors that had no names in any tongue spoken by the children of Ilúvatar. Crimson and black, orange shot through with veins of gold, the very air beginning to glow with heat that could be felt even at this distance. "My lord," said Galdor, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a captain who had learned to trust his instincts over long years of war. "Something is wrong." Fingolfin was already reaching for the signal horn that would alert the siege lines when the gates of Angband burst open. Not the slow, deliberate grinding of massive portals responding to chains and counterweights, but an explosive eruption that sent shattered metal screaming across the plain like a rain of deadly stars. From the breach poured something that was not quite fire and not quite darkness, but somehow both at once. A torrent of destruction that moved with the fluidity of water and the hunger of living flame. And riding at the crest of that impossible wave, terrible in his majesty and beautiful in his wrath, came Glaurung the Golden. The great drake had slumbered in Angband's deepest pits for centuries, growing in size and malice until he had become something that belonged more to nightmare than to the waking world. Now he emerged into daylight for the first time, and his presence alone was enough to make the very air catch fire. His scales gleamed like molten metal in the light of his own furnace heat, and when he opened his jaws, rivers of flame poured forth to carve channels of destruction across the carefully maintained siege works. Behind him came the hosts that Morgoth had hoarded for this moment, not the ragged companies of orcs and wolves that had tested the siege lines for 4 centuries, but armies that had been bred in darkness and shaped by malice until they had become weapons of war, given flesh and will. Balrogs strode among them like lords of destruction, their whips of flame turning the morning air into a furnace of agony. Orc companies marched in perfect formation, their discipline honed by generations of training in the deepest halls of the fortress. And over all of it, filling the sky like a plague of locusts, came the winged terrors that had waited so long for their moment of release. The northern siege lines disappeared in the first hour. Fingolfin watched from his command post as 4 centuries of careful engineering were reduced to ash and molten stone. The great towers that had taken decades to build toppled like children's toys before the dragon's fire. The tunnels that had been the marvel of elven engineering became death traps as flames poured through them like water finding the sea. The men and elves who had maintained those positions, veterans of 100 smaller battles, craftsmen who had dedicated their lives to the slow art of siege warfare, vanished into fire and smoke as if they had never existed at all. "Pull back the eastern companies," Fingolfin commanded, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos erupting around them. "Signal Fingon to abandon the forward positions and fall back to the secondary lines, and send word to—" The words died in his throat as he watched the eastern positions explode in flame. There would be no falling back to secondary positions because the secondary positions no longer existed. There would be no signaling Fingon because the signal towers had been reduced to smoking craters in the earth, and there would be no ordered withdrawal because the enemy was not advancing in the careful, measured way that allowed for such tactics. They were everywhere at once, as if Morgoth had somehow managed to weaponize the very concept of destruction itself. Goldor appeared at his elbow, the man's weathered face streaked with soot and grim with the recognition of catastrophe. "My lord, we must withdraw. The southern lines are collapsing. The western approaches are cut off. And Lord Fingon—" He paused, his voice catching. "Lord Fingon's position was overrun 20 minutes ago. We've had no word since the fighting reached his command post." The news hit Fingolfin like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain standing, to keep thinking, to continue being the leader his people needed, even as his world collapsed around him. Fingon, his eldest son, his heir, the bright flame who had inherited all of his father's courage and none of his caution, lost somewhere in the inferno that had once been the most secure siege lines in the history of warfare. "Survivors?" Fingolfin asked, though he could already read the answer in Goldor's expression. "Scattered groups making for the rally points. But my lord, the rally points—" Galdor gestured helplessly at the scene before them. "There are no rally points. There's nothing left to rally to." As if summoned by his words, a group of riders emerged from the smoke and chaos of the ruined siege lines. They rode hard, their horses lathered and wild-eyed, and even from a distance, Fingolfin could see the desperation in their movements. These were not the organized retreats of a planned withdrawal, but the frantic flight of soldiers who had seen their entire world consumed by fire. The lead rider reached the command platform at a full gallop, nearly falling from his saddle in his haste to deliver his report. Fingolfin recognized him. Thorin of Dorlomin, a young captain who had earned his rank through courage and competence during the long years of siege. "Lord Fingolfin," Thorin gasped, his words tumbling over each other in their urgency. The dragon. It's not just fire, my lord. It speaks. It knows our names, our strategies, our positions. It called out to Lord Brodder personally, knew details about his family, his fears. Half our men broke before it even reached our lines, and the other half— his voice cracked. The other half burned, my lord. They burned while it laughed. The implications of this struck Fingolfin like a cold blade between the ribs. A dragon that could speak, that possessed intelligence and malice rather than mere animal cunning, that could turn the very virtues of honor and loyalty into weapons against those who possessed them. This was not simply a beast to be fought, but an adversary that could corrupt and destroy morale as effectively as its flames could destroy flesh. Around the command platform, the remaining officers and advisors looked to their king with the desperate hope of men who needed someone to tell them that this catastrophe could still somehow be transformed into victory. But as Fingolfin stared out over the smoking ruins of everything he had built over 4 centuries of careful planning and patient work, he found no words of comfort to offer them. The siege was broken, not merely defeated or forced to withdraw, but utterly shattered, its pieces scattered to the winds like ash from a forge fire. The alliance that had seemed so strong only hours before was reduced to scattered refugees, fleeing for their lives across a landscape that had been transformed from familiar territory into an alien hellscape of fire and destruction. And somewhere in that chaos, Fingon was missing. His eldest son, the heir to everything Fingolfin had built, was lost in a maelstrom of flame and shadow and malice that showed no mercy to rank or relationship or the bonds of blood that had sustained the Noldor through every previous trial. "My lord," Goldor said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that some truths were too terrible to be spoken aloud, but too important to remain unspoken. "What are your orders?" Fingolfin closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of kingship settle onto his shoulders like a burden made of iron and grief and the ashes of everything he had hoped to preserve. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. Not defeat, not despair, but something harder and more dangerous. Something that burned with its own cold fire. "Signal the retreat," he said, his voice carrying across the platform with the authority of 4 centuries of leadership. "All surviving units are to fall back to the prepared positions in the hills. We salvage what we can, preserve who we must, and plan for what comes next." But even as he gave the orders, even as his remaining captains scattered to carry word to whatever forces still survived in the wreckage of the siege, Fingolfin's gaze remained fixed on the distant fortress where Morgoth now celebrated his victory. In the depths of his mind, behind the immediate concerns of retreat and regroupment and the preservation of his people, something else was taking shape. Something that tasted of wrath and of the kind of rage that could burn cold as winter starlight and twice as deadly. The siege had been broken. His life's work lay in ruins. His son was lost in the chaos of defeat, and his enemy had proven that patience and planning and the careful application of justice meant nothing when faced with the simple, brutal application of overwhelming force. Very well, then. If Morgoth wished to abandon the rules of civilized warfare, if he preferred the crude mathematics of destruction to the elegant strategies of siege and counter-siege, then perhaps it was time for Fingolfin to respond in kind. In the distance, the dragon's laughter echoed across the burning plain like the sound of mountains cracking, and in the heart of the High King of the Noldor, an answering fire began to burn. Not the wild flame of passion that had consumed his brother Feanor, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. The siege was broken. But the war Fingolfin realized with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute loss, was far from over. Rivers of fire continued to pour from the gates of Angband, carrying destruction to every corner of what had once been the most carefully defended territory in all of Beleriand. But somewhere in those flames, a different kind of fire was being kindled, the fire of a king who had lost everything, and now had nothing left to restrain his wrath. Morgoth had won the day, but in winning, he had created something far more dangerous than any siege, an enemy with nothing left to lose, and every reason to seek him out for a final, personal reckoning. The price of victory. 3 days after the breaking of the siege, Fingolfin stood in what had once been the command pavilion, and tried to comprehend numbers that seemed to exist in defiance of reason itself. The reports lay scattered across the table before him, like accusations written in blood and ash. 43 companies of Eldar, utterly destroyed. 18 formations of men, scattered to the winds, with perhaps 1 warrior in 5 accounted for among the living. The great siege engines that had been the pride of Noldorin engineering, reduced to twisted metal cooling in the ruins of positions that no longer had names, because there was no longer anything there to name. But it was not the military losses that carved the deepest wound in his heart. It was the other numbers, the ones that spoke to human cost in ways that tactical reports never could. 17,000 refugees streaming south toward the relative safety of Doriath, carrying nothing but the clothes they wore and the memories of homes that no longer existed. 3,000 children separated from their families in the chaos of the retreat, their names carefully recorded by scribes whose hands shook as they wrote. And somewhere among all those desperate souls, the faces of men and women who had trusted him, who had followed his banner for 4 centuries of siege, who had believed that their king's patient wisdom would see them safely through any trial. "My lord," said Belegond of Hithlum, his voice carefully neutral in the way that career soldiers adopted when delivering news that might break hearts. "We've had word from the eastern search parties. Lord Fingon has been found." Fingolfin's head snapped up, hope and dread warring in his expression. For 3 days his eldest son had been missing, last seen in the chaos of the northern line's collapse. For 3 days Fingolfin had been forced to balance the duties of kingship against the desperate need to search every burned hillside personally until he found some trace of the son who had inherited all his father's courage and far too little of his caution. "He lives," Belegond continued quickly, reading the anguish in his king's face. "Wounded, but he lives. His company managed to reach the rally point at Ethel-Sirion, though..." The captain's voice trailed off, his reluctance to continue speaking volumes about what he had left unsaid. "Though what?" Fingolfin's voice carried the dangerous stillness that his soldiers had learned to recognize as a warning. "Though he blames himself for the breakthrough, my lord. Says that if he had held his position longer, if he had managed his reserves better, if he had recognized the threat sooner." Belegond shook his head. "The healers say his physical wounds will mend. The other wounds, those may take longer." The news should have brought relief. His son was alive, safe, recovering from injuries that would heal. Instead, Fingolfin felt something cold and bitter settle in his chest. He knew his eldest son well enough to understand what self-recrimination would do to a spirit that had never learned to accept failure gracefully. Fingon would blame himself for defeats that no strategy could have prevented, would carry guilt for losses that belonged to the enemy who had chosen to abandon all restraint rather than risk further stalemate. "And Turgon?" Fingolfin asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Safe in Gondolin. The hidden passes were not discovered, and the veil remains untouched. Belegon's expression suggested that he found this news more troubling than comforting. But he sends word that he will not open his gates, my lord, not even for refugees. Says that secrecy is Gondolin's greatest strength, and that revealing the city's location would doom it to share the fate of the siege lines. The words hit Fingolfin like physical blows. Fingon consumed by guilt for a defeat he could not have prevented. Turgon sealed away behind hidden walls that would preserve his people, but could offer no aid to those beyond them. His sons, the heirs to everything he had built, the bright flames who were supposed to carry the light of the Noldor into future ages, scattered and wounded and driven to strategies born of desperation and despair. A soft sound from the pavilion's entrance made him look up to see Fingon himself, leaning heavily on a walking stick and moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had been broken and hastily repaired. His face was gaunt, marked by burns that would leave permanent scars, but it was his eyes that struck Fingolfin like a blade to the heart. They held the empty expression of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and no longer quite believed in the possibility of victory. "Father," Fingon said, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation, and 3 days of giving orders to men who were too shattered to properly obey them. "I came as soon as the healers would permit it. We need to talk about what comes next." "What comes next?" Fingolfin repeated, hearing his own voice as if from a great distance. "Yes, I suppose we do." Fingon moved to the table, studying the reports with the professional attention of a military commander assessing an impossible situation. The eastern approaches are completely compromised. The northern routes are still burning, will be for weeks, according to the scouts. The western passages might be passable, but only in small groups, and only if they can avoid the dragon patrols. He paused, his scarred fingers tracing routes on a map that bore little resemblance to the territory it was supposed to represent. "We can't maintain any kind of organized resistance from here. The infrastructure is gone, the supply lines are cut, and half our people are too traumatized to fight effectively, even if we had weapons to give them." "So," Fingolfin said quietly, "you counsel retreat. Full withdrawal to whatever safe havens remain. Abandonment of everything we have spent 4 centuries building." "I counsel survival." Fingon's voice carried an edge that his father had never heard before. Not anger, exactly, but something harder and more dangerous. "I counsel accepting reality, instead of clinging to plans that died in the fires of Ongband 3 days ago." He looked up from the map to meet his father's gaze directly. "The siege is broken, father. Not just tactically, but strategically, politically, psychologically. Morgoth has proven that patience and preparation and careful planning mean nothing when faced with sufficient application of raw force. We cannot answer dragons with siege engines, cannot counter Balrogs with earthworks, cannot defeat the kind of destruction we witnessed with any conventional approach." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, like a dare, like the sound of something precious breaking beyond all hope of repair. Around them, the pavilion felt suddenly too small, too confining, like a trap closing around possibilities that had once seemed as vast as the sky itself. "And so we abandoned them," Fingolfin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All those who followed us, all those who believed in us, all those who trusted that the High King of the Noldor would find a way to stand against the darkness. We tell them that their faith was misplaced, their sacrifices meaningless, their hope nothing but delusion." "We tell them the truth," Fingon replied, his tone gentling slightly, as he recognized the pain in his father's voice. "We tell them that some battles cannot be won through conventional means. We tell them that retreat is not surrender, that preservation of what can be saved is more important than grand gestures that accomplish nothing but satisfying pride. He reached across the table to place his hand on his father's arm. We tell them that a living king in exile is worth more than a dead hero whose gesture changes nothing. The touch should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the final weight that broke something inside Fingolfin's chest. He looked around the pavilion, at the reports that catalogued the price of his failure, at the maps that no longer bore any resemblance to the world they were supposed to represent, at his son, whose courage had been rewarded with scars and bitter wisdom about the limitations of honor in a world shaped by malice. A living king in exile, he repeated, tasting the words like poison. Is that what I have become, then? A curator of defeat, a shepherd of retreat, a guardian of the diminished and the defeated? Father. 400 years, Fingolfin continued, his voice growing stronger as something crystallized in his mind. 400 years of careful strategy, of patient siege, of building alliances and maintaining hope, and proving that the free peoples could stand together against any threat. 400 years of demonstrating that there were alternatives to the brutal mathematics of destruction. He stood abruptly, moving to the pavilion's entrance, where he could see the smoke still rising from the ruins of his life's work. And it meant nothing. All of it. Nothing. Behind him, he could hear Fingon starting to speak, words of comfort and counsel and reasonable advice about the necessity of accepting defeat gracefully. But Fingolfin was no longer listening. In his mind, he could see other images. Morgoth in his throne room, celebrating victory over an enemy who had never truly threatened him. The Dark Lord's servants reporting that the great siege was broken, and the High King of the Noldor was fleeing south with his tail between his legs like any common brigand routed by superior force. The thought was intolerable, not the defeat itself. He had always known that defeat was possible, had planned for contingencies and prepared fallback positions, and accepted that even the best strategies could fail when faced with sufficient disadvantage. But the idea that Morgoth would interpret this victory as proof that his vision of the world was correct, that fear was stronger than love and force more compelling than justice, that was a poison that would corrupt everything it touched. No, Fingolfin said, his voice carrying a finality that made his son fall silent. No, I will not be a living king in exile. I will not shepherd the defeated or curator of retreat or any of the other euphemisms you offer for the simple truth of failure. He turned back to face Fingon, and his son took an involuntary step backward at what he saw in his father's expression. Not despair, not grief, not even rage in any conventional sense. Something colder and more dangerous. Something that burned with the light of stars dying in the void. If conventional warfare cannot touch him, Fingolfin said with deadly calm, then perhaps it is time to try unconventional approaches. If patience and strategy and careful planning have proven inadequate, then perhaps the moment has come for more direct methods. Father, what are you saying? But Fingolfin was already moving, already walking toward his personal quarters where his armor waited, where Ringil hung in its scabbard like a promise yet to be fulfilled. Behind him, his son called his name with growing urgency, but the High King of the Noldor no longer had attention to spare for voices of reason and caution, and the kind of wisdom that led inevitably to defeat. In the depths of Angband, Morgoth celebrated his victory with all the satisfaction of a tyrant who had finally proven that fear was stronger than hope, that force was more reliable than justice, that the patient application of overwhelming destruction could break any alliance and humble any pride. He had not yet learned that in breaking the siege, he had created something far more dangerous than any army, a king with nothing left to lose, and no longer any reason to restrain the full fury of his wrath. The price of victory, Morgoth would soon discover, was sometimes higher than the cost of defeat, and some debts could only be paid in single combat before the gates of hell itself, with the wages of pride and the currency of blood. The last ride. Dawn had not yet touched the eastern sky when Fingolfin emerged from his pavilion, fully armored and moving with the deliberate purpose of a king who had made his final decision. The camp was quiet around him, not the peaceful quiet of soldiers at rest, but the hushed stillness that comes when everyone knows that something momentous is about to occur, and no one quite dares to acknowledge it aloud. Rochelor waited in the pre-dawn darkness, the great Destria's breath steaming in the cold air. The horse had been Fingolfin's companion for 3 centuries of war, had carried him through battles that would have broken lesser mounts, had learned to respond to his rider's will as if they shared a single mind. Now the animal stood with preternatural stillness, as if he too understood that this morning would be different from all the mornings that had come before. "My lord." Fingon's voice came from behind him, carefully neutral, but carrying undertones that spoke of a sleepless night and desperate internal debate. The eastern scouts report that the dragon patrols have withdrawn toward Angband. The route to Serek is clear, if you still intend to. "I do not ride to Serek," Fingolfin said quietly, his hands methodical as they checked the buckles and straps that would secure him to his saddle for what might be the last time, "nor to any other strategic position, where a reasonable king might establish a reasonable defense against a reasonable enemy." The words hung in the air between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Fingon moved closer, his scarred face etched with the expression of a son who was watching his father prepare to walk into fire. "Then where?" Fingon asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed. Fingolfin turned to face his eldest son directly, and in the grey light of approaching dawn, Fingon saw something in his father's expression that made him take an involuntary step backward. Not madness. That would have been easier to understand, simpler to argue against. What he saw instead was a terrible clarity, the absolute conviction of someone who had weighed all possible alternatives and chosen the only path that led toward something that might, in the most generous interpretation, be called victory. "I ride to Angband," Fingolfin said simply. "I ride to the gates of hell itself, and there I will do what 4 centuries of siege could not accomplish." "Father, no." The words came out more as plea than command. "Whatever you think this will achieve, whatever statement you believe it will make, it will change nothing. Morgoth will not meet you in single combat. He will not risk himself against a challenge he could simply ignore. You will ride to your death for no purpose except to satisfy pride that should have died with the siege lines." Fingolfin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past his son to take in the refugee camps that stretched to the horizon, the smoke still rising from the ruins of everything he had built, the faces of those who looked to him for guidance in a world that no longer offered any safe paths forward. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but perhaps not. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are times when the gesture matters more than the outcome, when what a king chooses to do in his final hour defines the meaning of everything that came before." He mounted Rochelor in a single fluid motion, the great horse responding to his touch as if they were extensions of the same will. "I will not flee south to become a king in exile, spending my remaining years organizing retreats and managing decline. I will not watch Morgoth grow fat on victory while his enemies cower in hidden valleys and debate strategies that avoid the simple truth of direct confrontation. You'll die, Fingon said bluntly. Whatever else happens, whatever grand statement you think you're making, you will die, and we will be left to carry on without you. Yes, Fingolfin agreed, his voice carrying no trace of doubt or regret. I will die, but I will die as a king should die, facing his greatest enemy, testing his strength against the ultimate challenge, refusing to accept that some battles cannot be fought simply because they cannot be won. He gathered the reins, feeling Roquelaur's muscles tense beneath him in preparation for movement. And when I am gone, when the songs are sung and the stories told, let them say this, that Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, met darkness with light, met force with courage, and met the greatest evil of the world with the simple truth that some things are worth dying for. Before Fingon could respond, before any of the assembled advisors could voice the protests that crowded their throats, Fingolfin touched his heels to Roquelaur's flanks and rode out of the camp at a pace that spoke of absolute determination and no intention of return. The sun rose as he rode, painting the devastated landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed somehow appropriate for a journey that would end in blood. Dornufauglith spread before him like a map of destruction, its familiar landmarks transformed into alien geography by 3 days of dragonfire and the passage of armies that existed to unmake rather than create. Where once there had been siege lines and earthworks, now there were only smoking craters. Where once there had been camps and supply depots, now there were fields of ash that would grow nothing for generations to come. But as Fingolfin rode north toward the source of all this destruction, something strange began to happen. The very air around him seemed to thicken with purpose, with the weight of absolute conviction transformed into something approaching physical force. Roquelaur's hooves struck the earth with the rhythm of war drums, and where they passed, the ash seemed to stir and settle into patterns that spoke of older powers than any that Morgoth commanded. The first to see him were a company of orcs, survivors from the Great Offensive who had been tasked with hunting down stragglers from the broken siege lines. They had been moving with the casual confidence of predators in territory they now controlled absolutely, their weapons ready, but their guard relaxed in the certainty that no organized resistance remained. That certainty died the moment they saw the lone rider approaching from the south. At first, the orc captain thought his eyes were deceiving him. A single horseman, riding alone across a battlefield where armies had been consumed by fire, approaching not with the desperate haste of flight, but with the measured pace of someone who had important business to attend to and would not be deterred by trivial obstacles. It made no tactical sense, violated every principle of survival that the captain had learned in decades of warfare. And yet there it was. Then the rider came close enough for details to become visible, and the captain felt his courage drain away like water from a broken cup. The horseman was tall and stern and beautiful in the way that the firstborn were beautiful, but there was something else about him that went beyond mere physical presence. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, not the crude force that Morgoth's servants wielded, but something older and more fundamental. When he looked toward the orc company, his grey eyes held depths that seemed to contain starlight and winter wind and the memory of music that had shaped the world before its shadow fell. "Orome," whispered one of the orcs, invoking the name of the hunter of the Valar in a voice that trembled with ancestral terror. "It is Orome himself, come to hunt us." The captain wanted to correct this obvious error, to point out that the Valar did not ride to war in Middle-earth, and that this was clearly just an elf lord who had chosen death over defeat. But the words died in his throat as the rider's gaze fell upon him directly. In that moment, the captain saw something that made him understand why his subordinates spoke of valor and hunting and divine retribution. This was not a broken king fleeing from defeat. This was wrath given form and purpose, riding north with the inevitability of sunrise, and twice as terrible. This was what happened when patience finally broke, and reasonable restraint gave way to the kind of fury that could shake the foundations of the world. The orc company broke and ran without orders, scattering in all directions like prey animals before a predator whose very presence violated the natural order. Behind them, they left weapons and supplies, and any pretense that they could stand against what was approaching Angband from the south. As the day wore on, similar scenes played out across the devastated plain. Messengers riding hard for the fortress, their reports growing more urgent and less coherent with each telling. Companies of orcs abandoning their positions without explanation. Wolf riders fleeing toward the protection of the mountains as if pursued by nightmares given substance. And through it all, Fingolfin rode north with the patience of stone and the fury of storm wind, his destination as fixed as the northern star, and his purpose as unalterable as the turning of the world. In the depths of Angband, the first reports reached Morgoth's throne room shortly after midday. A single rider, the messengers said, moving north across Dornu Fauglith toward the fortress. Their descriptions were confused, contradictory. Some spoke of an elf lord in silver mail, others of a figure wreathed in light that hurt to look upon directly. All agreed on one detail that made Morgoth lean forward in his throne with something that might have been anticipation or might have been dread. The rider was not fleeing. He was approaching. "How many companies accompany him?" Sauron asked, his perfect features betraying no emotion, but his voice carrying undertones of calculation and concern. "None, my lord," stammered the messenger, a lesser orc whose courage had been strained to its breaking point simply by delivering his report in the presence of powers that could unmake him with a thought. "He rides alone." "But lord, the effect on our forces." The creature's voice trailed off as it struggled to find words for something that defied easy description. "What effect?" Morgoth's voice carried the weight of mountains, the promise of consequences that would make mere death seem merciful. "They flee, my lord. Not in any organized fashion, not following orders or tactical doctrine. They simply flee, as if his presence alone is enough to break whatever courage they possess." The throne room fell silent, except for the distant hammering of forges and the closer sound of Morgoth's breathing, each exhalation carrying enough heat to make the air shimmer. Around the throne, his advisors waited for their master's response to news that made no tactical sense, and yet carried the unmistakable ring of truth. Finally, Morgoth spoke, his voice soft as falling ash and twice as deadly. "Fingolfin," he said, and the name seemed to echo in the vast chamber like a curse or a prayer or the sound of something precious breaking. After 4 centuries of patient siege, after careful strategies and measured approaches, and all the careful chess games of civilized warfare, he comes alone. "My lord," Sauron ventured carefully, "surely this is nothing more than the gesture of a broken king who prefers death to exile. One rider, no matter how noble or determined, cannot threaten Angband itself. We could simply ignore him, let him exhaust himself against our walls until—" "No." The word came out with such finality that it seemed to settle over the chamber like a physical weight. "No, we will not ignore him. We will not pretend that this is mere gesture or empty defiance. Morgoth rose from his throne, his massive form unfolding like some primordial darkness given shape and will. For I know what drives him north, what puts terror in the hearts of creatures bred for war, what makes grown orcs speak of Valar and divine retribution. He began to pace, each footstep sending tremors through stone that had been laid with the strength of mountains. He comes not as a supplicant or a refugee or a broken king seeking terms. He comes as himself, pure and undiluted, carrying 4 centuries of loyalty and justice and incorruptible virtue like a weapon forged specifically for my destruction. Morgoth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it filled the vast chamber completely. He comes to test the fundamental truth of what I am, what I have become, what I represent. And if I refuse that test... The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. If he refused, if he hid behind walls and armies and the crude mathematics of superior force, then he would prove that everything Fingolfin represented was stronger than everything he had become. He would demonstrate, before all his servants and all his enemies, and ultimately before himself, that virtue remained supreme, even in a world shaped by malice. The thought was intolerable. "Prepare the great doors," Morgoth commanded, his voice rising until it shook dust from the ceiling and set distant echoes ringing through the fortress's deepest halls. When he arrives, when he sounds his horn and issues his challenge, we will answer it. Outside, beyond the reach of Morgoth's sight, but not beyond the touch of his growing dread, Fingolfin rode the last miles toward Angband with the sun at his back and destiny waiting at the end of his road. Behind him, the plain stretched empty except for scattered signs of an enemy's presence that had melted away like mist before fire. Ahead, the towers of Thangorodrim rose against the sky like accusations carved in stone. The ride was almost over. Soon, very soon, the question that had haunted both king and tyrant for 4 centuries would finally receive its answer. Some truths, Fingolfin reflected, as he approached the gates of hell itself, could only be tested in single combat. At the gates of hell, the gates of Angband rose before Fingolfin like a wound torn in the world's flesh, black iron and adamant twisted into shapes that hurt to look upon directly. Behind those gates lay 4 centuries of accumulated malice, armies beyond counting, and powers that belonged more to nightmare than to the waking world. Before them sat a single horseman on a lathered destrier, both rider and mount breathing hard from their passage across a devastated landscape that stretched back to the horizon like a map of destruction. For a long moment, neither moved. The gates remained sealed, massive and implacable as the mountains they were carved from. Fingolfin sat motionless in his saddle, his grey eyes fixed on the fortress that had been the source of Middle-earth's shadow for longer than most mortal kingdoms had existed. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape the fate of the world. Then Fingolfin raised the horn that hung at his side, not a war horn meant for battlefield commands, but the ancient horn of the House of Finwë that had sounded in Valinor before the darkening, that had called the Noldor to council in halls where the light of the trees still shone. He set it to his lips, and blew a single, pure note that echoed from the walls of Thangorodrim like the voice of better days refusing to die. The sound rang through the fortress with a clarity that seemed to cut through stone and steel and the accumulated weight of ages. In the deepest halls, orcs cowered at a tone that spoke of things they had been bred never to understand. In the middle reaches, Lesser servants paused in their labours, as something stirred in memories they thought had been safely buried. And in the throne room at Angband's heart, Morgoth felt the note strike his consciousness like a blade of starlight thrust into darkness. When the echoes finally died, Fingolfin's voice rose to take their place, not shouting, not raging, but speaking with the authority of one who had ruled justly for centuries, and who now demanded nothing more than what justice required. Morgoth! The name rang against the iron gates like a challenge thrown down before the entire world. Melkor, first of the Ainur, master of lies and king of slaves, I name thee craven, coward, faithless and false. Too long hast thou sat in thy fortress of shadow, sending forth thy creatures to do what thou darest not do thyself. Come forth. If thou art more than the phantom of valour, thy servants proclaim thee to be. Inside Angband's throne room, the assembled court heard those words with the stunned silence of beings who had forgotten that such defiance was possible. For 4 centuries, they had grown accustomed to dealing with enemies who approached through proper channels, armies that could be countered with larger armies, strategies that could be answered with superior strategies, threats that could be managed through the application of overwhelming force. But this was something older and more fundamental. This was single combat offered by an equal, issued in terms that made refusal itself a kind of defeat. "My lord," Sauron said carefully, his perfect features arranged in an expression of studied neutrality. "Surely this is nothing more than the desperate gesture of a king who has lost everything and seeks only the warrior's death he believes will redeem his failure. We need not dignify such theatrics with a response." But even as he spoke, Sauron could see the tension in his master's massive frame, the way Morgoth's hands gripped the armrests of his throne until the metal began to creak under the pressure. This was not the reaction of a tyrant dismissing the empty threats of a beaten enemy. This was the response of someone who understood exactly what was being offered, and exactly what refusing that offer would mean. "He calls me craven," Morgoth said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the vast chamber completely. "He calls me coward. Before my own servants, before my own strength, he names me faithless and false, and suggests that I dare not face him as one king should face another." The Dark Lord rose from his throne, his massive form seeming to expand until it filled the space like a storm cloud, gathering strength. And the worst part, the most intolerable part, is that if I refuse, if I let him stand before my gates and issue challenges that go unanswered, then every word he speaks becomes truth. Around the throne, his advisors shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the trap that Fingolfin had laid with devastating precision. Refuse the challenge, and Morgoth would prove himself exactly what his enemy claimed, a coward who hid behind walls and armies rather than face personal risk. "But accept it, my lord," rumbled Gothmog, the Balrog's voice like the sound of mountains grinding together. "He is skilled, yes, but he is still only one of the Eldar. You are Morgoth, mightiest of the Ainur, master of power that shaped the world before its making was complete. What threat can any single enemy pose to such strength?" "That," Morgoth replied with bitter certainty, "is exactly what I once thought about the Silmarils, and about the ships at Alqualonda, and about 100 other things that I was certain could never slip from my grasp." He began to pace, each footstep sending tremors through stone that had been laid with the strength of mountains. "Fingolfin is not only one of the Eldar. He is what the Eldar could become if they were refined to their absolute essence. Courage without recklessness, justice without mercy, loyalty without question. He is every virtue I chose to abandon, given form and will, and a sword that has never known defeat." The pacing stopped, and Morgoth turned to face his assembled servants, with an expression that made several of them take involuntary steps backward. "But more than that," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "he is the test I have been avoiding for 4 centuries. The question I have been afraid to ask, the doubt I have been afraid to resolve. Is what I have become stronger than what he has remained? Is the power I have gathered through force and fear and the breaking of all bonds greater than the strength he has found in honor and sacrifice and the willing devotion of those who follow him freely?" Outside the throne room, Fingolfin's voice rose again, cutting through stone and steel and the accumulated weight of centuries with the clarity of a blade drawn in starlight. "I call upon thee, Lord of the Dark. Come thou forth, that we may settle between us the question that has poisoned the world, since first thou didst rebel against the music that made all things. Let it be decided once and for all whether power taken by force is stronger than authority granted by love, whether fear is mightier than hope, whether the kingdom built on slaves endures longer than the alliance forged among friends." The words struck the assembled court like physical blows. This was not mere personal challenge between rival kings, not the settling of ancient grudges or the resolution of tactical disputes. This was the fundamental question upon which everything else rested. What kind of strength was truly supreme in a world that contained both light and shadow, both creation and destruction, both the music that had shaped existence and the discord that sought to unmake it? "Answer me, shadow of former greatness." Fingolfin's voice carried now with something approaching divine authority, as if he spoke not merely as himself, but as the representative of every principle Morgoth had chosen to reject. "Face me as thou once faced Manwë in the councils of the Valar, when thou wert mighty among the Ainur, and not merely the king of slaves and creatures born in darkness. Show me that something remains of what thou once wert, or be content forever after, to know thyself truly craven." The silence that followed was absolute. In the throne room, not even the sound of breathing disturbed the weight of decision that pressed down upon them all. Outside the gates, Fingolfin waited with the patience of stone and the certainty of one who had wagered everything on a single throw of fate's dice. Finally, Morgoth spoke, his voice carrying the finality of mountains falling and worlds ending. "Open the gates, my lord," Sauron began, urgent now, all pretense of neutrality abandoned. "Consider what you risk. If I should fall, Morgoth cut him off with savage finality, then everything I have built, everything I have claimed, everything I have become, was always nothing more than elaborate delusion. But if I do not answer, if I let him stand before my gates and speak of cowardice while I cower behind walls like a merchant afraid of bandits, then I prove his point without the dignity of testing it in honest combat." He turned toward the great doors that led from the throne room toward Angband's outer defenses, his massive form moving with the deliberate purpose of someone who had made an irrevocable choice. "I am Morgoth," he said, his voice rising until it shook dust from the ceiling and set distant echoes ringing through the fortress. "I am the first and mightiest of the Ainur, the power that shaped mountains and sundered seas. I have made kings kneel and angels fall. I have broken the bonds of heaven and earth, defied the music of creation itself, carved my will upon the world through strength alone." He paused at the threshold, his hand on the great handle that would set in motion events no power could undo. And if all of that is not enough to defeat one elven king who fights for nothing but abstract principles, and the loyalty of those fool enough to love him, then perhaps it deserves to fall. The doors swung open with the groan of metal that had waited ages for this moment. Beyond them lay passages that led downward and outward, through halls where lesser servants scrambled to clear the path, through chambers where weapons of power waited to be claimed, through the very heart of the fortress that had been Morgoth's strength and sanctuary for longer than memory. And at the end of that path, beyond gates of iron and adamant, waited a single horseman who had crossed a devastated world to ask a question that could only be answered with sword and fire. The greatest duel in the history of creation was about to begin. But first, the gates of Angband had to open, and the Lord of the Dark had to prove whether he was still worthy of the title he claimed. Whether, after 4 centuries of ruling through fear and hiding behind walls, he still possessed the strength to face an enemy who had never learned to doubt that some things were worth dying for. In the distance, machinery groaned and great chains clanked as the outer defenses began their slow process of opening. Soon, very soon, Morgoth would step into sunlight for the first time in centuries, and the world would learn whether darkness truly was mightier than light, or whether in the end courage and honor and the love of justice were powers that no amount of accumulated malice could overcome. The duel of ages, the gates of Angband, opened with the sound of the world breaking, not the swift sudden movement that gates normally made, but a slow, inexorable grinding that spoke of mechanisms designed for something far larger and more terrible than any mortal architecture was meant to accommodate. Iron shrieked against adamant, ancient chains groaned under weights that had been calculated to restrain powers that belonged more to the music of creation than to any earthly realm. And through that widening breach, step by measured step, came Morgoth. Fingolfin had seen the Dark Lord before, in the distant days of Valinor, when Melkor had walked among the Valar as brother and peer. But that had been in the Blessed Realm, where even corruption wore the mask of beauty and malice, clothed itself in forms pleasing to behold. This was something altogether different. This was what Melkor had become when he embraced the fullness of his rebellion, when he abandoned all pretense of nobility and allowed his true nature to shape him according to its desires. He was tall beyond the measure of the children of Ilúvatar, his frame bearing the terrible majesty of one who had helped shape mountains and kindle stars. But where once there might have been beauty, now there was only a grandeur so awful that it hurt to look upon directly. His armor was black iron, wrought into forms that seemed to drink light from the air around them, and upon his head sat a crown of the same dark metal, its surface carved with sigils that spoke of dominion, claimed through force and held through fear. In his right hand he bore Grond, the hammer of the underworld, a weapon forged in the depths of Angband from metals that had never known the touch of starlight, its head wreathed in flames that burned without heat, but with a malice that could be felt like winter wind against the soul. For a long moment, the two figures faced each other across the scarred ground before Angband's gates, the Dark Lord in all his terrible majesty, and the Elven King astride his destrier, with his sword still sheathed, and his grey eyes calm as winter starlight. Between them lay not merely the space of a few dozen yards, but the gulf of 4 centuries of siege and war, the weight of every choice that had led them to this moment, and the fundamental question that could only be answered through the ultimate test of strength against strength. Then Fingolfin drew Ringil. The blade came free of its scabbard with a sound like crystal singing, its surface catching what little light remained in the world and reflecting it back as something pure and clean and utterly without compromise. This was no mere weapon forged by mortal craft, but one of the great swords of Valinor, wrought in the days when the light of the trees still shone, and when the Noldor had bent their skill to creating things of beauty rather than instruments of war. It had never known defeat because it had never been drawn for any cause less worthy than absolute necessity. "So," Morgoth said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them, despite being barely above a whisper. "At last we come to it. No armies, no strategies, no careful politics or patient siege. Just thee and me, and the question that has poisoned the world since first I chose my path." He raised Grond, and the weapon's dark fire cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any earthly light. "Come then, son of Finwë. Let us discover once and for all whether thy virtue is stronger than my will." Fingolfin's response was wordless. He touched his heels to Rockalor's flanks, and horse and rider moved forward, together with the fluid grace of perfect partnership. Not charging, not rushing toward reckless engagement, but advancing with the measured certainty of one who had calculated every angle and found them all acceptable. Morgoth's first blow came down like a falling mountain. The Dark Lord stepped forward and brought Grond around in an arc that would have shattered stone and turned iron to vapor, a strike that carried behind it not merely the strength of his physical form, but the weight of his accumulated malice and the power he had gathered through ages of domination. Where the hammer struck the earth, it carved a crater deep enough to swallow a house, and the air itself seemed to scream in protest at the violence done to the world's substance. But Fingolfin was not there. Horse and rider had flowed aside at the last possible moment, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of perfect trust between mount and man. As Grond completed its devastating arc, Ringil swept up and across in a silver line that opened a wound along Morgoth's thigh. Not deep, not immediately dangerous, but enough to draw dark blood that steamed when it struck the earth. The Dark Lord's roar of pain and surprise shook the mountains and set distant avalanches rumbling in the peaks of Thangorodrim. In 4 centuries of siege, in all the battles and skirmishes and careful strategies that had defined the conflict, no enemy had managed to so much as scratch the Dark Lord's physical form. The very idea that he could be wounded had seemed as impossible as wounding a mountain or cutting a star. But the blood on Fingolfin's blade was real, and the wound in Morgoth's flesh was proof that even the mightiest of the Ainur could bleed when faced with skill and courage applied with absolute precision. "First blood to thee," Morgoth acknowledged, with something that might have been respect or might have been hatred. But the duel is far from finished. What followed was combat that belonged more to legend than to any earthly battlefield. Morgoth's strength was overwhelming, his reach tremendous, his weapon capable of carving wounds in the earth that would remain as scars for ages to come. But Fingolfin fought with a skill that transcended mere technique, moving with the fluid grace of water, flowing around obstacles, striking with the precision of starlight, finding its target across impossible distances. Again and again, Grond fell with force enough to shatter kingdoms. Again and again, Fingolfin was simply not where the blow landed, having flowed aside with movements that seemed to predict the future itself, and each time the Dark Lord committed himself to an attack that missed its target, Ringil found its mark, a cut across the arm, a thrust to the shoulder, a slice that opened a gash along Morgoth's ribs and drew forth more of that dark blood that steamed and burned when it touched the ground. The second wound, the third, the fourth. Each cut was precise, calculated not just to inflict damage, but to demonstrate something far more dangerous than any physical injury. that Morgoth, for all his accumulated power and terrible majesty, was not invincible, that he could be touched, could be hurt, could be made to stumble and roar in pain like any mortal being faced with superior skill. Impossible, Morgoth snarled as he swung Grond in a wide arc that should have been impossible to avoid, but Fingolfin dropped low in his saddle, letting the weapon pass over him by inches, and rose again, with Ringil extended, to carve the 5th wound across the Dark Lord's chest. I am the first and mightiest of the Ainur. I shaped mountains with my hands and set stars in their courses. I will not be defeated by a mere elf who fights for nothing but abstract principles. Perhaps, Fingolfin replied with deadly calm, as he guided Roquelaure through a series of movements that flowed like dance, each step calculated to position him for the next attack, while avoiding the increasingly desperate swings of his opponent's weapon. But if those abstract principles give me the strength to wound thee 6 times while thou hast not even come close to striking me, perhaps thy understanding of strength is less complete than thou believest. The 6th wound opened across Morgoth's sword arm, and for a moment the Dark Lord's grip on Grond faltered. In that instant, Fingolfin saw his chance, and took it, driving Ringil forward in a thrust that should have ended the duel then and there. But Morgoth's reflexes, honed by ages of war and conflict, proved just swift enough. He twisted aside at the last moment, taking the blade in his shoulder instead of his heart, and swept his free hand around in a backhanded blow that finally connected. The impact sent Fingolfin flying from his saddle, his body striking the scarred earth with force enough to crack stone. For a moment he lay still, and Morgoth allowed himself a moment of savage satisfaction as he raised Grond for what should have been the killing blow. But as the hammer descended, Fingolfin rolled aside and came to his feet in a single fluid motion, Ringil still firm in his grip. The Dark Lord's weapon struck empty earth and carved another crater in the ground, but the Elven King was already moving, already positioning himself for the next exchange. 7th, he said simply, as his blade opened a cut along Morgoth's throat, not deep enough to be fatal, but close enough to remind both combatants that even the Dark Lord's life hung by threads no stronger than any other being's. 7 wounds, 7 proofs that the mightiest of the Ainur could be beaten, could be humbled, could be forced to acknowledge that there were things in the world that his power could not simply overwhelm. And with each cut, each perfectly placed strike, Fingolfin had demonstrated something that went beyond mere tactical victory. He had proven that courage and skill and the strength that came from fighting for something greater than oneself could stand against any force, no matter how terrible, no matter how seemingly insurmountable. But mortal flesh, even elven flesh, enhanced by the nobility of spirit and the strength of absolute purpose, had limits that even the greatest will could not transcend indefinitely. The duel had been raging for what felt like hours, and Fingolfin could feel exhaustion beginning to creep into muscles that had maintained perfect control throughout the supernatural combat. His breathing was growing labored, his movements beginning to lose the fluid perfection that had kept him alive against an opponent whose every blow could have killed him instantly. Morgoth, despite his wounds, despite the dark blood that flowed freely from 7 cuts that would never fully heal, still fought with the strength of one whose power had been drawn from the music of creation itself. He was weakening, yes, but not as quickly as his opponent, and he had begun to recognize the signs of Fingolfin's approaching limits. Growing tired. King of the Noldor? Morgoth taunted as he brought Grond around in another devastating arc. All thy skill, all thy courage, all thy noble principles, what do they matter when the flesh begins to fail? Fingolfin said nothing, focusing all his remaining energy on the intricate dance that kept him alive from moment to moment. But he could feel the truth in his opponent's words. Each dodge was a fraction slower than the one before. Each parry required effort that he could less and less afford to spend. Each strike, while still precise, lacked the devastating impact that had characterized the earlier phases of the duel. And then, as he stepped back to avoid yet another crushing blow from Grond, his foot came down, not on solid earth, but on the edge of one of the great craters that Morgoth's mist strikes had carved in the ground. The stumble was tiny, barely a moment's loss of balance, a single instant where perfect control wavered. But in a duel where the margin between life and death was measured in fractions of seconds, it was enough. Morgoth's foot came down on Fingolfin's neck with the weight of mountains behind it, and the High King of the Noldor fell to the scarred earth before the gates of Angband, his quest ended and his life flowing away into the darkness. But even as the light faded from his eyes, even as death claimed the greatest of the Noldor, Fingolfin managed one final act of defiance. Ringil, still gripped in his dying hand, swept up and across to carve one last wound in Morgoth's foot, a cut that would leave the Dark Lord limping for the rest of his days, a permanent reminder of the Elf King who had proven that even the mightiest evil could be wounded by those who fought for what was right. 7 wounds, and then an 8th. 7 proofs of mortality, and then a final testament that some victories belonged not to those who survived, but to those who chose to die rather than yield what could not be surrendered. As Fingolfin's body lay still beneath the dark sky, his sword finally falling from nerveless fingers, Morgoth stood over his fallen enemy and felt not triumph, but a cold certainty that this victory would haunt him for the rest of time. He had won the duel, had proven his strength superior in the end, but he had also learned something that he would have given anything not to know. Some things truly could not be broken. Some lights truly could not be extinguished, and some enemies, even in defeat, could wound their conquerors in ways that no amount of power or accumulated malice could heal. The greatest duel in the history of creation was over, and somehow, impossibly, both participants had lost the eternal wounds. For a long moment after Fingolfin's sword fell silent, Morgoth stood motionless over the body of his fallen enemy, dark blood flowing freely from 8 wounds that burned like liquid fire in his flesh. The silence that stretched between them was different from any that had come before, not the tension of anticipation, not the weight of decision, but the hollow emptiness that follows when something precious and irreplaceable has been lost to the world. Then, as if waking from a dream, Morgoth became aware of his own pain. It was not merely physical discomfort, though the wounds Fingolfin had inflicted throbbed with an intensity that surprised him. No enemy in all the long ages of his rebellion had managed to hurt him in his physical form, and the sensation was both novel and deeply unwelcome. But worse than the pain itself was what it represented. Proof that he was not invulnerable. Evidence that even the mightiest of the Ainur could be brought low by sufficient skill and courage. "So," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the aftermath of combat, "thou art defeated at last, King of the Noldor. All thy virtue, all thy courage, all thy noble principles, where are they now? Thy body lies broken before my gates, and thy great rebellion dies with thee." But even as he spoke the words, Morgoth knew they rang false. Victory should have felt different than this. It should have brought satisfaction, vindication, the sweet taste of an enemy's humiliation and defeat. Instead, it brought only a cold awareness that something fundamental had changed in the duel just concluded. something that could not be undone by any amount of gloating or posturing. He looked down at his foot, where Fingolfin's final stroke had opened a gash that ran from ankle to toe. The wound was not deep by the standards of the cuts he had received during the combat, but it throbbed with a particular insistence that spoke of permanence rather than temporary injury. And as he watched, he realized that the bleeding had not stopped, that the dark fluid continued to seep from the cut despite his body's natural healing abilities. It would not heal. None of them would heal. Not completely. 8 wounds that would remain with him forever. 8 permanent reminders of the Elf King who had proven that even the Dark Lord of Angband could bleed. The thought was intolerable. Morgoth raised his foot and brought it down with crushing force on Fingolfin's body, driven by a desperate need to prove that his victory was complete and final. The body beneath his weight crumpled like a broken doll, but instead of satisfaction, the act brought only a fresh surge of pain from the wound in his foot. Each step, each movement, would now carry with it the reminder of this encounter. Every time he walked, every time he stood, every time he moved through his fortress, he would feel the bite of Ringel one last time. "I am the victor here," Morgoth roared, as much to convince himself as to make any declaration to the world. "I am Morgoth, first of the Ainur, and I have defeated the greatest of the Noldor in single combat. Let no one say that any power can stand against me." But the words seemed to echo mockingly from the walls of Thangorodrim, and the pain in his wounds provided a constant counterpoint to his claims of supremacy. He bent down, intending to seize Fingolfin's body and drag it back into Angband for the kind of desecration that would make clear to all his enemies the fate that awaited those who dared challenge him. But as his hands reached for the still form, a shadow passed overhead, not the darkness of clouds or smoke, but something swift and purposeful that spoke of ancient powers older than his dominion. Thorondor, King of Eagles, descended from the heights of Thangorodrim like a bolt of divine justice given wings. The great eagle struck Morgoth's face with talons that raked across his cheek and left fresh wounds to match those already inflicted by Fingolfin's blade. Before the Dark Lord could react, before he could summon the power to strike down this new enemy, Thorondor had seized Fingolfin's body in his mighty claws and was rising again toward the peaks, carrying the fallen king away from any possibility of desecration or dishonor. No. Morgoth's cry shook the mountains and sent avalanches rumbling in the distance. He raised Grond and hurled it after the retreating eagle, but the weapon fell short, clattering uselessly among the rocks, while Thorondor disappeared into the heights with his precious burden. He was mine by right of conquest, mine to dispose of as I chose. But the eagle was gone, and with him went the only trophy that might have made this victory feel like something other than the Pyrrhic triumph it had become. Morgoth was left alone before his gates, bleeding from wounds that would never fully heal, watching his enemy's body carried to an honorable resting place beyond the reach of his vengeance. And in that moment, for the first time since the duel began, he allowed himself to truly acknowledge what had happened here. He had won. By any objective measure, he had emerged victorious from single combat with the greatest of his enemies. But victory had come at a price that he was only now beginning to understand. 8 wounds that would never heal, marking his body with permanent proof that he was not invincible. A limp that would dog his steps for the rest of eternity, reminding him with every movement of the Elf King who had dared to challenge him. And perhaps worst of all, the knowledge that his enemy had chosen death rather than yield, had found in courage and principle a strength that even overwhelming force could not break. The political implications alone were staggering. Word of this duel would spread throughout Middle-earth, carried by whatever spies and messengers had witnessed it from afar. The story would grow in the telling, as stories always did, but the core truth would remain. Morgoth could be wounded. The mighty could be brought low. Even the greatest powers of darkness were not beyond the reach of those who fought for light. His enemies would draw hope from that truth. His allies would begin to doubt. And he himself would carry the scars forever. Slowly, painfully, Morgoth made his way back toward the gates of Angband. Each step sent fire through the wound in his foot. Each movement reminded him of the cuts along his arms and chest and throat. His servants, emerging tentatively from the fortress now that the duel was concluded, took one look at their wounded master and fell back in terror and confusion. The Dark Lord had returned victorious, but he returned changed, marked, humbled, no longer the invincible force he had been when he strode forth to meet Fingolfin's challenge. In the heights of the encircling mountains, Thorondor alighted on a peak that overlooked the hidden valley of Gondolin. There, on stone that caught the first light of dawn and reflected it back toward the heavens, he laid Fingolfin's body with the reverence due to a king who had died, as a king should die. When Turgon emerged from the secret ways of his city to claim his father's remains, he found the High King of the Noldor lying in state upon stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The wounds that had ended his life were clean and honorable, marks of battle fairly fought and bravely lost. There was peace in the still features, and something that might have been satisfaction in the expression of a king who had asked the ultimate question and received an answer that, while costly, had been worth the price. Turgon wept then, as sons weep for fathers who have been both shield and burden, both protection and impossible standard to live up to. But beneath the grief, there was pride as well. His father had died as he had lived, facing his greatest enemy directly, refusing to compromise or calculate or accept that some battles could not be fought. He had proven that courage was stronger than corruption, that principle could wound even the mightiest evil, that some lights could not be extinguished no matter how much darkness was brought to bear against them. The cairn that Turgon built upon that peak became a landmark that could be seen from great distances, a monument not to defeat but to the kind of victory that transcended mere survival. Travelers passing beneath would look up and remember that there were things worth dying for, that some stands must be taken regardless of the odds, that the measure of a life lay not in its length, but in the courage with which it was spent. And in the depths of Angband, Morgoth learned to walk with a limp that would never leave him, to live with wounds that would never heal, to rule from a throne that now carried the weight of doubt as well as dominion. He had won his duel, proven his strength, superior in the end. But he had also learned that victory could taste like defeat, that triumph could feel like loss, that some enemies could wound their conquerors even in dying. Every step reminded him of Fingolfin. Every movement brought fresh pain from wounds that refused to close completely. And every night, in the small hours when even the mighty must face themselves without the armor of justification, he wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, he had been wrong about the fundamental nature of strength and what it meant to truly win. The duel was over. The High King of the Noldor was dead. But the questions his courage had raised, the doubts his sacrifice had planted, the wounds his skill had inflicted, these would endure long after his body had been laid to rest beneath the stars he had loved in life. Morgoth had feared Fingolfin for 4 centuries because he represented everything the Dark Lord had chosen to abandon. Now, in death, he had become something even more dangerous, eternal proof that those choices had come at a cost, that could never be fully paid. The wounds would never heal, and somewhere in the depths of his black heart, Morgoth suspected that perhaps, just perhaps, that was exactly as it should be. The fear that remains. In the weeks that followed the duel, those who served in the deeper halls of Angband began to notice changes in their master that went beyond the obvious limp or the bandages that covered wounds that refused to heal properly. Morgoth had always been terrible in his wrath, overwhelming in his power, capable of inspiring fear that could break the strongest will. But now there was something else in his presence. A restlessness, a tendency to start at unexpected sounds, a habit of checking shadows as if he expected enemies to emerge from them. The great throne room, once filled with the confident pronouncements of a tyrant secure in his dominion, now echoed with silences that stretched too long and conversations that died mid-sentence when their master's attention seemed to turn inward. Reports were delivered with more hesitation than before, as if his servants sensed that their lord's certainty in his own invincibility had been shaken and were unsure how to navigate this new reality. "The eastern patrols report no significant enemy activity, my lord," Sauron said during one such audience, his perfect features carefully neutral as he delivered intelligence that should have been routine. The scattered remnants of the siege forces continue to flee southward, seeking whatever sanctuary they can find among the kingdoms that remain outside our influence. Morgoth's response was not immediate. For long moments he sat motionless upon his throne, his gaze fixed on something beyond the physical boundaries of the chamber. When he finally spoke, his words carried an edge that had not been there before the duel. "And what of the songs?" he asked, his voice soft, but somehow carrying more menace than his loudest roars had before. "What do our spies report of the songs they sing in their scattered camps, in their hidden refuges, in the halls of those kings who still believe themselves free?" Sauron hesitated, a pause so brief that a mortal observer might have missed it entirely, but long enough to confirm what Morgoth had already suspected. The news from beyond his borders was not what a victorious tyrant might hope to hear. "They sing of Fingolfin, my lord," Sauron admitted finally. "Of his ride across Dor-nu-Foglith, of his challenge at your gates, of—" He paused again, calculating how much truth his master could bear. "Of the wounds he inflicted in single combat." "7 wounds," Morgoth said with bitter precision, each word weighted with pain that was both physical and psychological. 7 cuts that will never fully heal, 7 permanent reminders that the mighty can indeed be brought low. His hand moved unconsciously to his throat, where one of Ringil's strikes had come closest to ending the duel in Fingolfin's favor. And they sing of these wounds as if they were victories, rather than the desperate strikes of a dying king. My lord, surely the death of their high king, the shattering of their great alliance, the destruction of 4 centuries of careful siege, means nothing, Morgoth cut him off with savage finality, if the manner of his dying gives them more hope than the fact of his death gives them despair. He rose from his throne, the movement accompanied by the slight catch in his step that would now mark every journey across every floor for the rest of eternity. "Do you know what they call him now, my faithful lieutenant? What name they have given to the king who died before my gates?" Sauron's silence was answer enough. "Fingolfin the Valiant," Morgoth continued, beginning to pace in the deliberate manner he had adopted to minimize the impact of his limp. "Fingolfin the Bold, Fingolfin the Unbowed, who proved that even the mightiest evil could bleed." Each title fell like a blow, each epithet a reminder of victory, transformed into something dangerously close to defeat. They do not sing of my triumph. They sing of his courage. They do not celebrate his death. They celebrate his willingness to die rather than yield what could not be surrendered. The implications hung in the air between them, like a map of future difficulties. Every song that celebrated Fingolfin's courage was a recruitment tool for their enemies. Every story of the wounds he had inflicted was proof that Morgoth could be hurt. Every retelling of the duel was a challenge to others who might possess similar nobility, similar determination, similar willingness to pay any price in service of what they believed was right. "And there will be others," Morgoth said, giving voice to the fear that had haunted him since the moment Ringel first drew his blood. That is the poison he has left behind, the legacy of his grand gesture. Somewhere in the kingdoms that remain, some other noble fool is hearing these songs and thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, they too could wound the Dark Lord of Angband. His pacing stopped, and he turned to face Sauron directly. They will come, one by one or in groups, seeking to prove their valor against the enemy who showed them that such proof was possible. And each one who draws my blood, each one who forces me to fight for my life, rather than simply crushing opposition through overwhelming force, weakens the foundation upon which my entire dominion rests. Sauron had served his master long enough to recognize the truth in this assessment. Fear was the cornerstone of Morgoth's power, not merely the reasonable fear that mortals felt when faced with superior force, but the deeper terror that came from facing something that seemed truly invincible. Strip away that invincibility, prove that the great power could be wounded and forced to struggle and made to pay a price for victory, and the entire structure of intimidation began to crumble. "Then we ensure that none reach you," Sauron suggested, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone proposing strategies to a superior whose mood had become unpredictable. "We strengthen the outer defenses, increase the patrols, create barriers that no single challenger could possibly breach." "And prove their point for them," Morgoth replied with bitter laughter. "Hide behind walls and armies and elaborate defenses. Demonstrate that the Dark Lord of Angband now fears individual challengers enough to avoid them entirely." He moved to the great window that looked out over his domain, his gaze taking in the armies and fortifications and accumulated power that had once seemed sufficient to cow any opposition. "No, that way lies only a different kind of defeat. We cannot simply refuse all challenges without appearing weak, but we cannot accept them without risking further demonstration of our mortality." The strategic dilemma was as cruel as it was inescapable. Every future challenger would carry with them the implicit threat that Fingolfin's example represented. Some would be weak, easily crushed, their defeats serving to restore the aura of invincibility that had been damaged. But others might possess their own measure of the courage and skill and incorruptible determination that had allowed one elven king to wound the mightiest of the Ainur 8 times in single combat. And each such encounter would carry the risk not merely of physical injury, but of further erosion of the fear that kept enemies at bay and allies in line. "He knew," Morgoth said softly, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration or might have been hatred. Fingolfin knew what his death would accomplish. Not military victory, not tactical advantage, not even the preservation of his people or his kingdom. He knew that the greatest service he could render his cause was to prove that I could be touched, could be hurt, could be made to struggle for supremacy, rather than simply claiming it by right of superior power. In the months that followed, reports from across Middle-earth confirmed the accuracy of this assessment. The scattered remnants of the Great Alliance did not dissolve into despair, as might have been expected after such devastating defeat. Instead, they carried with them stories that spread like wildfire through every kingdom and refuge that remained outside Morgoth's direct control. The song spoke of 7 wounds that would never heal, of a tyrant's limp that marked every step, of proof that evil was not invincible regardless of how mighty it seemed. Young warriors heard these tales and felt their courage kindle. Veteran soldiers who had grown weary of endless, hopeless struggle found their resolve renewed. Kings and lords who had been considering surrender or accommodation discovered that resistance remained not only possible but necessary, and in quiet moments, when the public duties of kingship were set aside and the masks of leadership could be lowered, even the mighty found themselves checking shadows and starting at unexpected sounds. For if one elven king, armed with nothing but a sword and absolute conviction, could wound Morgoth 8 times in single combat, what might 2 such champions accomplish? Or 3? Or an entire generation raised on the understanding that even the greatest evil could bleed? The fear that Morgoth had felt when watching Fingolfin approach across the devastated plain had been immediate, visceral, tied to the specific threat of that particular enemy. But the fear that remained was something deeper and more lasting, the knowledge that somewhere in the world another hero might be taking up sword and armor and the banner of defiance, inspired by the example of one who had chosen death over surrender, and in dying had proven that some lights could never be extinguished. In his private moments, in the small hours when even the mighty must face themselves without the armor of justification, Morgoth would run his fingers along the scars that marked his body and wonder which of his remaining enemies might possess the same terrible courage that had carved them there. The wounds served as constant reminders not merely of past pain, but of future possibility, the chance that his next challenger might prove even more dangerous than the last. It was a poisonous kind of victory, the sort that left its winner weaker than the defeated. Morgoth had proven his strength superior in the end, had demonstrated that overwhelming power could triumph over skill and courage when pushed to its absolute limit. But he had also learned that some victories came at a cost that could never be fully calculated, that some defeats could be more devastating to the winner than to the loser. And in the deepest places of his black heart, where even he rarely dared to look, Morgoth carried the growing suspicion that Fingolfin's greatest triumph had not been wounding him 8 times in combat, but teaching him what it meant to be afraid. For fear, once learned, was a lesson that could never be unlearned, and no amount of power, no depth of accumulated malice, no height of claimed dominion could erase the simple truth that somewhere in the world courage existed that could not be broken, nobility that could not be corrupted, and love of justice that could not be defeated, no matter how much force was brought to bear against it. The duel was over, the king was dead, the immediate threat was ended. But the fear remained, and would remain, a permanent part of what Morgoth had become. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the greatest victory that any enemy of evil could achieve, to plant doubt in the heart of darkness itself, and leave it there to grow like a seed that would one day bear fruit in ways that could not yet be imagined. In the end, Morgoth had feared Fingolfin, not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented. And now, in death, he represented it more powerfully than ever. Eternal proof that some things in the world truly could not be broken, should not be broken, and would endure long after those who sought to destroy them had been forgotten. The fear that remains is the fear that endures. And some fears, once awakened, never die.